Welcome back to Forbidden Lore. Tonight, we are not simply telling a story, we are stepping into something that was never meant to be remembered. Across thousands of years, ancient Hindu texts have been studied, translated, worshipped, and preserved with great care. But hidden between the verses, buried beneath layers of symbolism and time, there are fragments of something far more unsettling. Whispers of beings that walked the earth long before us, not gods, not humans, but something in between. They were said to be vast in size, towering beyond imagination. Their presence was described as both divine and deeply terrifying. And yet, in modern retellings, many of these details seem to vanish. Scholars call them metaphors, myths, exaggerations of a distant past. But what if that is not the truth? What if entire passages were altered, removed, or deliberately misunderstood? Because what they describe is not symbolic at all. What if the ancient texts were trying to warn us? Tonight, we will explore a forgotten narrative hidden within sacred writings, a story of giants who shaped the world before humanity ever understood it. A story of conflict, silence, and something that may still be waiting beneath the surface of our world. And as we move deeper into this story, you may begin to wonder, if they were real, why did they disappear? Or perhaps a more unsettling question, did they ever truly leave? Long before the modern world began to measure history in precise timelines and documented events, there existed stories that were never meant to be easily understood. They were not written for casual readers. They were not meant to be explained. They were meant to be remembered, quietly and with caution. Among the oldest surviving records of human civilization are the sacred texts of ancient India, texts that have endured for thousands of years, passed down through memory, ritual, and careful transcription. They speak of gods, of creation, of cycles of destruction and rebirth. But there are moments within these texts where the tone shifts, where the language becomes heavier, more uncertain, as if the writers themselves were struggling to describe something they did not fully comprehend. These moments are easy to overlook. A line here, a phrase there, fragments that seem out of place among grand philosophical ideas and divine narratives. Most readers pass over them without a second thought, but some did not. There are scholars, scattered across time, who noticed the same unsettling pattern. Descriptions that do not quite fit within the framework of mythology, references to beings that are not clearly gods, nor human, nor anything in between. Beings described not only by their power, but by their size, enormous, unnatural, impossible. In certain translations, they are dismissed as poetic exaggerations, symbols of strength, metaphors for chaos. But older interpretations, the ones less polished and less widely circulated, suggest something else entirely. They describe figures that walked upon the earth itself, not in the heavens, not in distant realms, but here. They left marks upon the land. They shaped structures that no ordinary human hands could have built. They were present in the earliest chapters of existence, long before recorded kingdoms and known civilizations. And then, something strange begins to happen. As the texts are copied and recopied over generations, these descriptions begin to change. Details soften. Measurements disappear. Certain passages are shortened or rewritten. It is not an abrupt erasure. It is something far more subtle, a gradual fading, as though the memory of these beings was being gently pushed out of reach. There is no official record explaining why, no single moment where someone decided to remove them. Only a pattern that becomes clearer the closer one looks. And patterns in ancient texts are rarely accidental. In the oldest layers of these writings, there are references to an age that came before the age of humans, an age that is not described in detail, but always hinted at. A time when the world was not yet balanced, when forces moved across the land in ways that no longer occur. And in this distant, almost forgotten age, there are mentions of figures whose presence altered the natural order, not as creators, but as inhabitants. This distinction is important. They were not described as gods who formed the world. They were described as beings who existed within it, beings who walked, who acted, who left consequences behind. And perhaps most unsettling of all, beings who interacted with what would eventually become humanity. In later interpretations, these interactions are often reframed, turned into allegories, simplified into moral lessons. But in their earliest forms, the descriptions feel far less symbolic. They feel observational, as though someone, at some point, was attempting to record what they had seen or been told without fully understanding it. There are passages that speak of shadows falling across entire regions, not from clouds, but from figures that moved. There are mentions of voices that could be heard across great distances, not carried by wind, but by something else entirely. And there are fragments that describe structures, not temples, not monuments, but places of dwelling, scaled far beyond human proportions. These are not the central focus of the texts. They are not given full explanations or elaborate narratives. They appear briefly, and then they are gone. Which raises a question that has troubled a small number of researchers for generations. Why include them at all? If they were only symbolic, why not describe them clearly as such? If they were meant to teach, why not explain their meaning? Instead, they are left incomplete, unresolved, almost hidden in plain sight. There is another detail that is often ignored. In several early commentaries, written centuries after the original compositions, there are subtle disagreements, not about philosophy, not about ritual, but about interpretation. Certain scholars insisted that these descriptions should not be taken literally, that they were poetic devices. Others, however, were less certain. They questioned why such specific details would be used if the intent was purely symbolic. Why describe scale in measurable terms? Why reference interactions that suggest physical presence? Why, in some cases, attempt to explain their disappearance? Because there are passages that do exactly that. They do not simply mention these beings, they hint at their absence. They speak, in quiet and indirect ways, of a time when these figures were no longer seen. Not because they never existed, but because something changed. And that change was not described as natural. There are words that translate loosely into concepts like conflict, imbalance, or correction. Terms that suggest an event, something that disrupted the order of that earlier age. But once again, the details are missing. Or perhaps they were never meant to remain. Over time, as these texts were studied and standardized, the more ambiguous elements became less emphasized. Teachings were clarified, narratives were refined, and anything that did not fit comfortably within the evolving understanding of the world was quietly set aside. Not destroyed, but not highlighted either. It is in these overlooked spaces that the most unusual details remain, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them, to read not just what is written, but what is implied, and to ask questions that are rarely asked. What if these fragments are not distortions of truth, but remnants of it? What if they represent something that was once widely known and then slowly forgotten? Not through a single act of deception, but through generations of reinterpretation. Because memory, especially collective memory, does not disappear all at once. It fades, it shifts, it becomes something easier to accept, and in doing so, it leaves behind traces of what it used to be. Traces that, when gathered together, begin to form a different kind of story. A story that does not align neatly with mythology or history. A story that exists somewhere in between, uncomfortable, unfinished, and perhaps unintended. Because if these ancient texts truly contain echoes of something real, something physical, something that once walked the earth, then the question is no longer whether these beings existed. The question becomes why their presence feels so carefully obscured, and why, even now, those fragments remain, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed once again. If the earliest fragments of ancient texts suggest the presence of something unusual, then the copies that followed reveal something even more unsettling. Not what was written, but what was changed. For centuries, these texts were not preserved through printing or digital storage. They were carried forward by human hands, copied line by line, generation after generation. Each copyist was trained to be precise, to preserve every word with care, to ensure that nothing was lost. And yet, no matter how careful the process, something always changes when a text is rewritten. Sometimes it is accidental, a misplaced word, a subtle shift in phrasing. But other times, the changes feel deliberate. In certain surviving manuscripts, when scholars place different versions side by side, a pattern begins to emerge. It is not obvious at first. The structure remains the same, the stories continue uninterrupted, but the details begin to shift. Descriptions that were once vivid become vague. Measurements that once seemed precise are softened into abstraction. Entire lines are shortened or replaced with more familiar interpretations. And most curiously of all, some passages simply disappear. Not in a dramatic way, not with visible gaps or missing pages, but as though they were never there to begin with. In older versions, there are moments where the text lingers on physical descriptions, not just of gods or celestial beings, but of something else, something that walked upon the ground. These descriptions are unusual in their specificity. They speak of height in terms that exceed normal human scale. They describe movement that alters the surrounding environment, footsteps that leave impressions too deep, shadows that stretch too far. Voices that carry not through air alone, but through something heavier. In later versions, these same passages often remain, but altered. The scale is reduced. The language becomes symbolic. What once sounded like observation begins to read like metaphor. And with each successive version, the transformation becomes more complete, until eventually the original tone is almost entirely gone. There is no single authority responsible for these changes, no record of a decision to rewrite history. Instead, what we see is a gradual process, a kind of quiet correction, as though the text itself was being guided toward a more acceptable form. Scholars who have studied these variations often explain them as natural evolution, the result of cultural shifts, linguistic changes, and interpretive traditions. And in many cases, that explanation is reasonable. But there are certain details that resist such simple answers. For example, in some of the oldest recoverable fragments, there are repeated references to scale that are remarkably consistent. Different passages, written at different times, describe beings of similar proportions using comparable terms, suggesting a shared understanding. This consistency is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And yet, in later versions, this consistency disappears. Each mention becomes isolated, less defined, easier to reinterpret. It is as though the clarity itself was the problem, as though precise descriptions made something too real, too difficult to ignore. There are also instances where entire sequences of events appear to have been compressed. In one version, a passage might describe an encounter, a presence observed, a reaction recorded. In another version, that same passage becomes a single line. The encounter is reduced to symbolism. The presence becomes abstract. The reaction is no longer described at all. The narrative remains intact, but the meaning shifts. And once again, the question arises, why? Why preserve the structure of the story, but alter the details that give it substance? Why not remove these elements entirely if they were considered unnecessary or misleading? The answer may lie in the nature of tradition itself. Ancient texts, especially sacred ones, are not easily discarded. They carry authority. They hold cultural and spiritual significance. To remove large sections would be noticeable, controversial. But to adjust them slowly, to reinterpret them over time, that is something else entirely. That is something that can happen without drawing attention. There are also records of debates among early commentators, discussions that hint at uncertainty, not about the moral teachings of the texts, but about how certain descriptions should be understood. Some argued strongly for metaphor, insisting that references to enormous beings were symbolic of power or chaos. Others were less convinced. They pointed to the consistency of early descriptions, to the way certain passages seemed to describe physical interaction rather than abstract ideas. They questioned why such details would exist at all if they were never meant to be taken seriously. These debates did not result in a clear conclusion, but over time, one interpretation became dominant, the symbolic one. And as it did, the texts themselves began to reflect that shift. Words that once suggested physical reality were replaced with terms more aligned with philosophy. Descriptions of presence became descriptions of influence. Actions became allegories. The transformation was not immediate, but it was steady. And once it reached a certain point, it became self-reinforcing. New generations of readers encountered only the refined versions. They interpreted them according to the established framework, and the older meanings became increasingly difficult to recover. Unless one went looking for them. Unless one compared versions, studied fragments, traced the subtle differences across time. And those who did often found themselves facing the same unsettling realization. That something had been reduced, not erased completely, but diminished, as though the original descriptions carried a weight that later interpretations sought to lighten. There is another aspect to consider. In a few rare cases, annotations left by scribes provide insight into their decisions. These notes are brief, often written in margins or appended at the end of passages. Most deal with linguistic clarifications or corrections, but a small number reference something else. They mention uncertainty, not about grammar or structure, but about meaning. Phrases that suggest hesitation, statements that imply the original wording was difficult to accept or understand. In some instances, there are indications that a particular term was replaced because it seemed inappropriate, too literal, too strange. These notes do not provide a full explanation, but they offer a glimpse into the mindset of those who preserved the texts. They show that the process was not purely mechanical. It involved judgment, interpretation, choice. And with each choice, the text moved slightly further from its earliest form, until what remained was something familiar, something safe, something that could be studied without raising uncomfortable questions. But the fragments that escaped this process still exist, scattered across incomplete manuscripts, preserved in obscure archives, referenced in translations that are rarely cited. And when these fragments are brought together, when they are examined without the assumptions of later interpretations, they begin to tell a different story. A story that is not fully visible in any single version, but emerges through comparison, through patience, through the willingness to look beyond what is commonly accepted. It is a story that suggests the ancient writers were not simply creating myths. They were recording something they did not fully understand, something that later generations struggled to interpret, and eventually, something they chose to soften. to reshape, to quietly move out of focus. Because whatever these beings were, however they were described, their presence did not fit easily into the world that followed. And so, line by line, word by word, they were not erased, but they were made distant, until they became something else entirely. Something that could be read without being truly seen, and yet not completely forgotten, because the traces remain, hidden within the variations, waiting for someone to notice that the differences are not random, that the omissions are not accidental, and that the story, in its earliest form, may have been far more literal than anyone was meant to believe. Long before the first cities rose from the earth, before the earliest kings carved their names into stone, before history learned how to remember itself, there are whispers of something older. Not older in the sense of forgotten ruins or buried artifacts, but older in presence, older in dominance, older in a way that suggests the world once belonged to something else entirely. In the deepest layers of ancient Hindu narratives, there are repeated suggestions of an age that existed before the age of man. It is not described as empty, nor is it described as chaotic. It is described as occupied, but not by humans, and not in the way later civilizations would understand occupation. There are no nations, no borders, no structured societies as we know them. Instead, there are presences, vast and powerful, moving across the land with a kind of certainty that implies they did not arrive. They were already there. In these early references, the language does not attempt to elevate them into divinity, nor does it reduce them to monsters. They are described in a way that feels almost observational, as though they were simply part of the natural order of that time. But the details remain unsettling, because these beings are not described in terms that align with anything familiar. They are not merely larger than humans, they exist on a scale that reshapes the environment around them. There are mentions of ground that trembles not from earthquakes, but from movement, of rivers that shift their course after a single passage, of forests that bend or break as something passes through them. These are not isolated metaphors. They appear in multiple fragments, across different sources, with a consistency that suggests shared knowledge rather than creative invention. And yet, they are rarely given a clear name. In later interpretations, they are often grouped with known mythological beings, assigned identities that fit within established frameworks. But in their earliest forms, they resist categorization. They are simply described. And what is described is difficult to ignore. There are passages that speak of forms rising above the horizon, not as distant mountains, but as moving silhouettes, shapes that block light, that cast shadows over entire regions. There are accounts of sound, not voices in the human sense, but something deeper, low and resonant, felt as much as heard, as though the air itself struggled to carry it. And then there are the interactions, because these beings, whatever they were, did not exist in isolation. They are described in proximity to early human presence, not large populations, not developed societies, but small groups, observers, witnesses. In some fragments, these early humans are depicted as cautious, keeping their distance, avoiding direct contact. In others, the encounters are unavoidable. A presence appears, a shadow falls, a sound is heard, and the reaction is immediate. Not curiosity, but fear. Not the fear of something unknown, but the fear of something overwhelming, something that cannot be resisted. There are descriptions of individuals who attempt to approach, drawn by curiosity or necessity. What they experience is not always described in detail, but the outcomes are consistent. They do not return unchanged, if they return at all. These accounts are not framed as heroic encounters. They are not stories of triumph or conquest. They are records of imbalance. Encounters where one side does not belong in the presence of the other. And this imbalance is emphasized repeatedly, not through direct explanation, but through contrast. The scale of one against the fragility of the other. The permanence of one against the fleeting nature of the other. It is in this contrast that a disturbing implication begins to form. That these beings were not temporary. They were not visitors. They were part of the world in a way that early humans were not. At least, not yet. There are also references to structures, though the word structure may not fully capture their nature. They are not described as buildings in the traditional sense. They are described as formations, places where these beings gathered or resided, locations marked by unnatural geometry, by materials that do not behave as expected. In some passages, these places are described as emerging from the ground itself, rather than being constructed, as though they were shaped rather than built. Their scale is consistent with the beings associated with them. Too large, too precise, too enduring, and most importantly, too ancient. Because even within these early texts, these formations are already described as old, which suggests that the beings themselves may have existed for far longer than the accounts imply. This introduces another layer of uncertainty. If these beings were already ancient in the earliest records, then how far back does their existence truly extend? There are also hints of hierarchy, subtle distinctions in description that suggest not all of these beings were the same. Some are described with greater presence, greater influence. Others appear less frequently, their actions less defined. But the details are incomplete, as though the observers did not fully understand what they were witnessing, or perhaps as though they were not meant to. And then, within these fragments, there are moments of change, not sudden disappearance, but a shift, a sense that the world itself was beginning to transform. The descriptions of these beings become less frequent, less detailed, not because they are being removed, but because their presence is no longer as dominant. There are suggestions of resistance, of forces emerging that begin to challenge the existing order. But, once again, the details are limited. The texts do not provide a clear narrative of conflict. They do not describe a decisive event. Instead, they offer fragments, moments where something begins to push back, where the balance starts to shift. And the beings that once moved freely across the land begin to appear less often, less visibly, until eventually they are no longer described as part of the present, but as something that belonged to an earlier time, a time before. This transition is not explained, it is not celebrated, it is simply acknowledged. And then, gradually, it is left behind. But not entirely. Because even as their presence fades from the main narrative, echoes remain. References that do not fully align with the idea that they are gone. Mentions of distant regions where something still lingers, of places that are avoided, of sounds that are heard but not understood. These echoes are subtle, easy to dismiss, but they persist, and they raise a question that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. If these beings were truly part of the earliest age of the world, if they existed alongside the first humans, if they shaped the land and left behind traces of their presence, then what caused their decline? What shifted the balance? And more importantly, did they truly disappear? Or did they simply move beyond the reach of those who recorded these texts? Because if the earliest accounts are not purely symbolic, if they are based on observation, on memory, on something that was once seen, then the absence of these beings is not the end of the story. It is only the point at which the story becomes harder to follow, more fragmented, more uncertain, and perhaps more dangerous to understand. Because whatever these beings were, however they existed, they were not imagined in the way modern readers might assume. They were described too consistently, too carefully, too cautiously, as though those who recorded them understood one thing very clearly: that they were not meant to be ignored, even if, over time, they would be forgotten. Or perhaps remembered in a way that no longer revealed what they truly were. If the beings described in the earliest fragments truly walked the earth, then they did not pass through it without leaving something behind. Presence, especially on such a scale, does not vanish without consequence. It reshapes. It alters. It leaves marks that persist long after movement has ceased. And within the ancient texts, scattered and often overlooked, there are references to places that do not belong to the world as we understand it. Not natural formations, not sacred temples built by human hands, but something else entirely. Places that are described with a quiet uncertainty, as though even those who recorded them struggled to define what they were seeing. In later interpretations, these locations are often categorized as mythological realms, symbolic landscapes, metaphors for spiritual states. But in their earliest descriptions, they are grounded. They are placed within the world, given direction, distance, context. They are described as destinations, not ideas. There are passages that speak of regions where the land itself appears altered, not by erosion or time, but by design. Surfaces that are too smooth, angles that are too precise, materials that reflect light in unnatural ways. In some accounts, travelers describe approaching these places from a distance. At first, they appear like mountains, rising abruptly from the horizon, too uniform to be entirely natural. But as the distance closes, the illusion fades. The shapes become clearer. Edges emerge, lines sharpen, and what once seemed like a natural formation reveals itself as something constructed, or perhaps shaped. There is a recurring detail in these descriptions that is difficult to dismiss: scale. Not just large, but disproportionate. Doorways that rise far beyond any possible human height. Openings that suggest entry, but not for anything we would recognize. Surfaces marked with patterns that do not repeat in the way human designs typically do. Arrangements that feel intentional, yet impossible to interpret. In some fragments, these places are described as silent, not abandoned, but absent of the sounds one would expect. No wind, no movement, no indication of life. And yet, there is a presence, an awareness, as though the place itself is not entirely empty. There are also mentions of pathways, not roads in the traditional sense, but routes, wide and smooth, extending across the land with a consistency that suggests purpose. They connect these locations, linking one structure to another across distances that would be difficult for humans to traverse. In later retellings, these pathways are often described as symbolic journeys, spiritual transitions from one state of being to another. But in earlier accounts, they are physical. They are walked, measured, observed, and always they are described as too large, too perfectly formed to have been created by human effort alone. There are also references to interior spaces, though these descriptions are rare and often incomplete. Those who entered these places speak of scale that distorts perception, rooms that extend beyond visible limits, ceilings that disappear into shadow, walls that do not behave as solid surfaces should. Some describe a sensation of pressure, not physical weight, but something more subtle, as though the space itself resists their presence, as though it was not meant to be occupied by beings of their kind. And then there are the markings, not inscriptions in any known language, but patterns, lines that intersect and diverge, shapes that suggest meaning, yet remain unreadable. In some cases, these markings are described as faintly luminous, not bright, but visible even in darkness. And more curiously, they are not always static. There are accounts, though rare and often dismissed, that suggest movement, not of the structure itself, but of the markings upon it, shifting slightly, rearranging in ways that cannot be easily explained. These details are often excluded from later versions of the texts, considered too strange, too difficult to interpret. But in the fragments where they remain, they add a layer of unease that is difficult to ignore, because they suggest that these places were not simply built and abandoned. They suggest something more active, more persistent. There is another aspect that appears repeatedly in these early descriptions: orientation. These structures are not placed randomly. They align with one another, across great distances, in ways that imply coordination, as though they were part of a larger system, a network. Though the purpose of this network is never explained, only hinted at. There are passages that describe standing within one of these places and observing another in the distance, perfectly aligned, visible through openings that frame the horizon with unnatural precision. This level of alignment is not impossible, but it requires intent, planning, understanding of scale and distance that would be difficult to achieve without advanced knowledge. And yet, the texts do not describe the builders as engineers or architects. They do not describe the process of construction. They simply describe the result, as though the creation of these places was not something to be questioned, but something to be accepted. Which brings us back to the beings themselves, because the scale of these structures aligns with the descriptions of those who came before. The height of the openings, the width of the pathways, the vastness of the interior spaces, all of it suggests that these places were not designed for humans. They were designed for something larger, something that required space on a different scale. There are also hints that these places were not merely dwellings. They served a function, though what that function was remains unclear. Some passages suggest gathering, others imply observation. There are even fragments that hint at control, not over people, but over the environment itself. Mentions of changes in weather, shifts in light, alterations in the behavior of the land surrounding these structures. These references are brief, often lacking detail, but they appear often enough to suggest that they were not isolated ideas. And then, just as with the beings associated with them, something changes. The descriptions of these places become less frequent, less detailed. In later texts, they are still mentioned, but no longer described as accessible. They become distant, remote, difficult to reach, or perhaps deliberately avoided. There are warnings, though subtle, phrases that suggest caution, advice to remain at a distance, not out of reverence, but out of something closer to fear. And eventually, these places shift from being part of the world to being part of legend. Their physical descriptions replaced with symbolic interpretations, their locations obscured or forgotten, until they become something that can be discussed without being believed. But the earliest fragments remain, quietly preserved in incomplete manuscripts and overlooked translations. And when they are examined together, they suggest something that is difficult to reconcile with conventional understanding. That long before human civilizations began to shape the world, there were already structures in place, already systems that spanned distances, already evidence of design on a scale that does not align with human capability. And if these places were real, if they were built or shaped by the beings described in earlier accounts, then they are not simply remnants of a lost civilization. They are something else entirely. Something that does not fit within the timeline we are familiar with. Something that suggests the world, at one point, was organized in a way we no longer understand. And perhaps most unsettling of all, something that may not be entirely gone. because structures of that scale do not simply disappear. They erode, they collapse, they become buried. But traces remain, hidden beneath layers of time and interpretation, waiting to be found, or perhaps waiting to be recognized for what they truly are. Not ruins of the past, but evidence of something that once existed here, on a scale we were never meant to inherit. If the earliest texts speak of presence, and the scattered fragments hint at structures that should not exist, then there is another layer, quieter and far more difficult to reconstruct, a layer that does not describe creation or coexistence, but disruption. Because in the same ancient records that mention these vast beings and their impossible cities, there are subtle indications that something went wrong. Not suddenly, not with a single defining moment, but gradually, as though the balance of that earlier age began to fracture. At first, the signs are almost unnoticeable. A shift in tone, a change in language. Descriptions that once felt observational begin to carry weight. A sense of tension that was not present before. There are passages where the environment itself is described as unstable, not in the natural sense of storms or seasonal change, but something deeper. Rivers that do not follow their usual paths, land that trembles without cause, skies that darken without warning. In later interpretations, these are often read as symbolic representations of cosmic imbalance, but when placed alongside the earlier descriptions of immense beings and structured landscapes, a different interpretation begins to emerge. One that suggests these changes were not purely natural, but connected. Connected to something that was happening within the world itself. There are also fragments that describe movement, not of individuals, but of many. Large presences shifting across the land with purpose, no longer wandering, no longer isolated, but directed. This is one of the first indications that whatever these beings were, they were not acting independently. They were part of something larger, a collective, or perhaps opposing collectives. Because within these same fragments there are references to division, not clearly explained, not openly described, but present. Words that translate loosely into separation, disagreement, or conflict. Terms that appear briefly and then vanish, as though they were never meant to be emphasized. And yet they appear often enough to suggest that something significant was unfolding. There are accounts, though fragmented, that describe encounters not just between these beings and early humans, but among the beings themselves. Descriptions of sound that goes beyond the deep resonance mentioned in earlier passages. Sound that carries force, that alters the surrounding environment. There are mentions of impact, not described as weapons or tools, but as events. Collisions that leave marks upon the land, scars that remain visible long after the moment has passed. In some fragments, entire regions are described as having changed shape, not gradually, but abruptly, as though something immense had occurred. And then there are the silences, because where one might expect detailed accounts of such events, there is instead absence. Moments where the narrative seems to approach explanation and then turns away, as though the details were known but not recorded, or perhaps not preserved. This absence is not random. It appears consistently at points where the implications would become unavoidable, where the existence of conflict would no longer be subtle, but undeniable. There are also references to something that opposes these beings, though it is never described with clarity. In later interpretations, this opposing force is often associated with divine intervention, with gods restoring balance to the world. But in the earliest fragments, the distinction is less clear. The opposing presence is not always described as divine. It is described as different, as something that does not belong to the same order, something that emerges rather than descends. This distinction is subtle, but significant. because it suggests that the conflict may not have been between gods and giants, but between different kinds of beings altogether. Beings with different roles, different origins, different relationships to the world. There are passages that describe moments of stillness following these events. Not peace, but aftermath. The kind of silence that follows something too large to fully comprehend. In these moments, the land is described differently, less stable, less certain, as though whatever balance once existed had been disrupted beyond easy repair. And then, gradually, the descriptions of the immense beings begin to change, not in their form, but in their presence. They are no longer described as moving freely across the land. They are mentioned less often, appearing in fewer locations. Their actions become more limited, more contained, as though something has restricted them or forced them to withdraw. There are also hints of loss, though not described in direct terms. There are fewer references to gatherings, fewer indications of coordination. The sense of unity that appeared earlier begins to fragment, and with it, the scale of their presence seems to diminish. But not completely, because even as their activity decreases, the traces of what occurred remain. There are mentions of regions that are no longer habitable, of areas that are avoided without explanation, places where the land itself is described as altered in ways that do not return to normal. These descriptions persist across multiple sources, often without context, as though the events that caused them were once understood, but no longer remembered. There are also passages that suggest deliberate action, not just conflict, but response. Attempts to contain, to limit, to prevent further disruption. Though once again the details are unclear. The texts do not describe strategies or outcomes, only the sense that something was being done, something that changed the trajectory of what was happening. And then, over time, the references begin to fade. Not disappear entirely, but become distant, as though the events themselves were being pushed further into the past, reframed as something less immediate, less relevant, until they become part of a story rather than a record. This transformation is subtle, but it is consistent with the patterns seen in earlier sections. Details are reduced, context is removed, meaning is softened, until what remains is something that can be interpreted without discomfort. But when the fragments are examined together, when the early descriptions are considered alongside the later alterations, a different picture begins to form. One that suggests that the world, at some point in its distant past, experienced something far more significant than simple mythological conflict. Something that involved beings of immense scale, structures that spanned vast distances, and forces that altered the environment itself. And that whatever this event was, it was not fully preserved, not because it was forgotten, but because it was never meant to be remembered clearly. Because clear memory would lead to clear questions, and clear questions would lead to conclusions that may not align with the world as it is understood today. So instead, the story was allowed to remain, but only in fragments, only in forms that could be reinterpreted, only in ways that obscured its original meaning. And yet, even in this altered state, the traces of that conflict remain, hidden within the language, embedded in the structure of the narratives, waiting for someone to notice that the silence within these texts is not empty. It is filled with what was left unsaid. Because whatever happened in that distant age, whatever caused the beings who once dominated the world to withdraw, it was not a minor event. It was something that reshaped everything that followed. And the fact that it is no longer clearly described may be the most telling detail of all. Because some events are not forgotten by accident. They are forgotten by design. As the fragments of earlier ages become more difficult to trace, the narrative begins to shift into something more familiar. The language becomes structured. The figures become defined. The stories take on meaning that can be interpreted and taught. This is the point where mythology, as it is commonly understood, begins to take form. Gods are named. Roles are assigned. The universe is explained through cycles, balance, and purpose. But beneath this clarity, there are inconsistencies. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss, yet persistent enough that they begin to form a pattern. Because not all of these so-called gods behave in ways that align with divinity, at least not in the way later traditions would define it. Some are described not as eternal beings, but as presences that move across the world. They travel, they arrive, they depart. They occupy space, and more importantly, they are described with physical attributes that are difficult to reconcile with purely spiritual existence. In certain passages, their size is emphasized, not metaphorically, but in relation to their surroundings. They stand above landscapes. They interact with structures that match the scale described in earlier fragments. In some cases, they are said to enter places that have already been established as far too large for humans. Places that were previously associated with the immense beings of the earlier age. This overlap is rarely addressed directly, but it is there, and it raises a question that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. What if some of the figures later identified as gods were not entirely separate from the beings that came before? What if the distinction between deity and inhabitant was not as clear as it is now believed to be? There are also moments where these figures display limitations. Not weaknesses in the moral sense, but constraints. They can be challenged. They can be opposed. They can even be forced to withdraw. This is not how divine beings are typically portrayed in their most refined form. It is, however, consistent with entities that exist within the same system as one another. Entities that operate under certain rules, even if those rules are not fully understood. There are passages that describe confrontations, not always direct, not always violent, but present. Encounters where one presence must yield to another, where dominance is not assumed, but contested. In later interpretations, these encounters are often framed as moral or cosmic struggles, representations of good overcoming chaos. But the earliest descriptions do not always support this framing. They describe interaction, not judgment. They describe outcome, not necessarily meaning. And within these interactions, there is a recurring theme: scale. These figures are not simply powerful, they are large. Their actions affect the environment in ways that align with physical presence rather than abstract influence. There are descriptions of ground shifting beneath them, of structures responding to their movement, of distances being crossed in ways that suggest immense size. And yet, over time, these details are softened, reduced, reinterpreted, until the emphasis shifts from form to function, from presence to symbolism. The gods become less like beings and more like ideas, more like forces that exist beyond the physical world. But the earlier layers remain, hidden beneath the later interpretations. And when examined closely, they reveal something unexpected. There are also inconsistencies in how these figures are described across different texts. In one version, a figure may be presented as eternal and unchanging. In another, the same figure appears to have a beginning, an emergence, a moment of arrival. This contradiction is often resolved through theological explanation. Cycles of manifestation, different aspects of the same entity. But another possibility exists, one that is less comfortable, that these figures were not originally conceived as eternal gods, but as beings whose existence was observed, recorded, and only later elevated into divinity. This process is not unique to any one tradition. Throughout history, figures of great influence or power have often been transformed into something more than they originally were. Their stories refined, their actions reinterpreted, their limitations removed, until what remains is something idealized, something that fits within a structured belief system. But in the case of these ancient texts, the transformation appears incomplete, because traces of the earlier descriptions still remain, details that do not fully align with the idea of purely divine beings. There are also references to hierarchy among these figures, not just differences in role, but differences in scale and presence. Some are described as towering above others, their influence extending further, their actions carrying greater impact. This hierarchy is often explained in terms of power or importance, but the descriptions themselves suggest something more literal, differences that can be observed, measured, compared. And once again, the connection to the earlier beings becomes difficult to ignore. Because the same patterns of variation appear in both sets of descriptions, not all are equal, not all are the same. There is also the matter of location. Many of these figures are associated with specific places, not abstract realms, but physical locations. Mountains, regions, structures, places that are described in ways that align with the earlier accounts of unusual environments and constructed formations. In some cases, these locations are said to be inaccessible to ordinary humans, not because they are distant in a spiritual sense, but because they are physically unreachable, too large, too elevated, too altered. This suggests that whatever these places were, they were not simply imagined. They were part of the world, even if only a few could approach them. There are also moments where these figures interact directly with humans, not as distant deities, but as present entities. They speak, they act, they influence events in tangible ways. In later interpretations, these interactions are often framed as divine intervention, moments of guidance or judgment. But in earlier descriptions, they sometimes feel less symbolic, more immediate, as though the boundary between human and non-human was not as clearly defined. And then, over time, the transformation continues. The physical details fade. The scale becomes less emphasized. The interactions become more abstract, until the beings that were once described in terms of presence and form are understood primarily through their roles: creators, protectors, destroyers, concepts that can be taught, understood, and accepted without raising questions about their origin. But the fragments that remain suggest that this was not always the case, that at some point the line between God and inhabitant was not clearly drawn, that what was later understood as divine may have begun as something else, something that existed within the world, something that was seen, heard, recorded, and only later reinterpreted. Because if the earliest descriptions are taken seriously, if they are read not as metaphor but as observation, then the figures that dominate these ancient narratives may not be entirely what they appear to be. They may be echoes of something older, something that once moved across the land on a scale that no longer exists, something that was powerful enough to shape the world and present enough to be remembered, even if that memory was gradually transformed into something more acceptable, more structured, more distant, and far less unsettling, but not entirely removed. Because even now, beneath the layers of interpretation and belief, the original descriptions remain, quietly preserved, suggesting that the gods of these ancient texts may not have been gods, at least not in the way they are understood today. As the descriptions of immense beings fade into reinterpretation, and the figures once grounded in presence are elevated into divinity, another layer of the ancient texts begins to emerge, one that is often overlooked. Not because it is unimportant, but because it is too easily misunderstood, or perhaps too easily ignored. This layer does not describe beings directly. It describes actions, practices, rituals. At first glance, these rituals appear consistent with what one might expect from ancient traditions. They involve repetition, sound, gesture. They are performed with precision, passed down carefully, preserved with a level of detail that suggests importance. But within this structure, there are elements that do not align with symbolic or devotional practice. There are instructions that feel specific in a different way, not symbolic, but functional, as though the purpose is not merely to express belief, but to produce a result. Some of these rituals involve sound, not simple recitation, but sequences, patterns of tone and rhythm that must be performed exactly. The texts emphasize this precision repeatedly, not as a matter of tradition, but as necessity. There are warnings attached to these instructions, statements that suggest deviation is not simply incorrect, but dangerous. In later interpretations, these warnings are often understood in a moral or spiritual sense. Incorrect performance leads to ineffective results, or symbolic imbalance. But the language used in earlier fragments suggests something more immediate, more physical. There are references to outcomes, not metaphorical consequences, but observable effects. Changes in the environment, alterations in perception, moments where something is described as responding, though what that something is remains unclear. There are also rituals associated with specific locations, not general spaces of worship, but places that are described with unusual detail. Remote areas, elevated regions, structures that align with earlier descriptions of non-human scale. These rituals are not meant to be performed anywhere. They require proximity, as though the location itself is part of the process. This raises an important question. If the rituals are symbolic, why would location matter so precisely? Why would certain actions only be effective in specific places, unless those places possess properties that are not immediately visible? There are also references to timing, not in terms of seasons or calendars, but alignment. Moments when certain conditions are met. Conditions that are not fully explained, but are described as necessary. These alignments are rare, difficult to predict, and once again, the texts emphasize precision, as though the ritual is not complete without them. In later traditions, such details are often interpreted as part of spiritual discipline, a way to focus intention and maintain order. But when combined with the earlier references to presence and structure, they begin to suggest something else. That these rituals were not only acts of devotion, but attempts at interaction. Attempts to reach, to connect, or perhaps to access. There are also fragments that describe the effects of these rituals in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Changes in sound. Not external noise, but something perceived internally. Low frequencies, resonance that seems to originate from within the body rather than outside it. There are descriptions of altered perception, not visions in the symbolic sense, but shifts in scale, in distance, in the way space itself is experienced. Some accounts describe the environment as becoming unfamiliar, not physically changing, but being perceived differently, as though something previously hidden becomes visible, or perhaps as though the observer is momentarily aligned with something beyond ordinary perception. These descriptions are often brief, incomplete, and in later versions, they are frequently omitted. But where they remain, they introduce a level of unease that is difficult to ignore. Because they suggest that the rituals were not purely internal experiences, they had external consequences, even if those consequences were not fully understood. There are also warnings, not general cautions, but specific statements, instructions not to perform certain sequences without proper preparation, without guidance, without understanding. The language of these warnings is notable. It does not speak of moral failure. It speaks of risk, of exposure, of encountering something that should not be encountered. There are even fragments that suggest that some rituals were discontinued, not because they were ineffective, but because they produced results that were considered unacceptable. Though the nature of these results is not described in detail, only hinted at. This pattern is consistent with the broader theme that runs through these ancient texts. Details are present, but incomplete. Explanations are implied, but not provided, as though the full understanding was never meant to be preserved, or perhaps never meant to be widely known. There are also references to individuals who specialized in these practices, not priests in the traditional sense, but practitioners, those who studied the patterns, who understood the sequences, who knew when and where certain rituals could be performed. These individuals are not always portrayed positively. In some fragments, they are respected. In others, they are viewed with caution, as though their knowledge places them in a position that is not entirely safe. There are even suggestions that some of them sought something beyond what was intended, that they attempted to extend the rituals, to push beyond established limits, and that the outcomes of such attempts were not always controlled. These accounts are rare, often fragmented, but they align with the recurring theme of boundaries, lines that should not be crossed, processes that should not be altered. Not because they are sacred, but because they are unstable. There is another detail that appears in several early descriptions: the idea that the rituals do not create something new, but reveal something that is already present. This distinction is subtle, but important. It suggests that whatever these practices interact with, it is not summoned from elsewhere. It is accessed. It exists already, beyond ordinary perception, beyond ordinary interaction. And the ritual serves as a method of alignment, a way to momentarily bridge that gap. If this interpretation is correct, then the implications are difficult to ignore, because it would mean that the presence described in earlier fragments, the immense beings, the structures, the altered environments, were not entirely removed from the world. They were simply no longer accessible, not through normal means, but perhaps through specific actions, specific conditions, specific understanding. And if that is the case, then the gradual disappearance of these rituals, or their transformation into symbolic practices, takes on a different meaning. It is not simply a shift in tradition. It is a loss of function, a removal of method, a way of ensuring that whatever was once possible is no longer easily achieved. Because if these rituals were truly capable of interacting with something beyond ordinary perception, something that once existed in physical form, then their continued use would present a risk. Not theoretical, but real. A risk that may have been recognized, even if it was not fully understood. And so, like the descriptions of the beings themselves, the rituals were preserved, but altered. Their structure maintained, their meaning softened, until they became something safe, something that could be practiced without consequence, or at least without the original consequence. But the fragments that remain suggest that this transformation was not complete, that traces of the original purpose still exist, hidden within the precise instructions, the unusual warnings, the details that do not align with purely symbolic practice. And for those who examine these fragments closely, who consider them not as metaphor, but as method, a different possibility begins to emerge. That the ancient texts do not merely describe a forgotten past. They contain remnants of a process, a way of interacting with something that once shaped the world, something that may still exist beyond reach, but not beyond access, if one were to follow the instructions as they were originally intended. And that possibility, more than anything else, may explain why so much of it was allowed to fade into obscurity. Because some knowledge is not lost by accident. It is set aside, reinterpreted, and quietly buried for a reason. One that becomes more difficult to ignore the closer one gets to understanding what those rituals were truly meant to do. As the rituals fade into obscurity and the knowledge required to perform them correctly becomes fragmented, another form of contact begins to appear within the ancient accounts, less direct, less controlled, but perhaps more revealing. It does not require preparation. It does not depend on location or alignment. It happens without invitation, and often without understanding. It begins with dreams, not ordinary dreams shaped by memory or imagination, but experiences that feel external, intrusive, as though something is being observed rather than created. In several early fragments, there are descriptions of individuals who report the same visions, not similar, but identical. They describe vast landscapes that do not match any known geography, endless plains with no horizon, structures of impossible scale rising in the distance. And within these places, there are presences, not always visible, but unmistakable. A sense of something that exists beyond the edge of perception, watching, waiting. These accounts are unusual not only because of their content, but because of their consistency. Different individuals, separated by distance and time, describing the same environments, the same structures, the same feeling of scale and displacement. In later interpretations, such experiences are often explained as symbolic dreams, shared archetypes, expressions of the collective unconscious. But the earliest descriptions do not present them as symbolic. They are recorded as events, occurrences that happen to the individual, not created by them. There are also references to the physical effects of these dreams. Upon waking, individuals report sensations that persist, a lingering pressure, a sense of disorientation, difficulty adjusting to normal perception. In some cases, there are descriptions of sound, not heard externally, but remembered with unusual clarity, low, resonant tones. Similar to those described in earlier passages involving immense beings, this connection is not explicitly stated, but it is difficult to ignore, because the characteristics are consistent. The same depth, the same weight, the same sense that the sound is not carried through ordinary means. There are also accounts where multiple individuals experience these dreams at the same time, in the same location, without prior communication. They wake with matching descriptions, matching details, as though they were present in the same place, observing the same environment. This phenomenon is rare, but it appears often enough in early fragments to suggest that it was not dismissed entirely. There are even references to attempts to document these experiences, to compare details, to identify patterns, though the results of these efforts are not fully preserved, only hinted at. There is another detail that appears in several of these accounts: the sense of scale. Not just visual, but physical. Individuals describe feeling smaller, not metaphorically, but in relation to their surroundings, as though the environment itself operates on a different scale. This sensation is often accompanied by a feeling of vulnerability, not fear in the conventional sense, but an awareness of imbalance, of being out of place. This aligns closely with the earlier descriptions of human encounters with immense beings, where the difference in scale is not just observed, but experienced. There are also moments within these dream accounts where forms become visible, not clearly, not fully defined, but present. Shapes that move slowly across the landscape, silhouettes that block light, that alter the perception of distance. These descriptions are consistent with earlier fragments that refer to moving presences of enormous size. Once again, the connection is not explicitly made, but the similarities are difficult to dismiss. There are also references to attempts at communication, though these attempts are not verbal. They do not involve language. Instead, they are described as impressions, concepts that appear fully formed, not spoken, not heard, but understood. In some cases, these impressions are described as overwhelming, too complex to process, too vast to interpret, as though the human mind is not equipped to receive them fully. This leads to incomplete recall, fragmented memory, and in some cases, a reluctance to revisit the experience. There are also warnings within these fragments, not about performing rituals, but about engaging with these dreams. Advice to avoid focusing on them, to resist the urge to return, because there are suggestions that attention itself may strengthen the connection, that repeated exposure leads to deeper involvement. Though what that involvement entails is not clearly described, only implied. There are even accounts of individuals who begin to experience these dreams more frequently, more vividly, until the distinction between dream and waking perception becomes less stable. They report seeing fragments of the same environments during waking hours, hearing the same tones in moments of silence. This progression is not presented as a desirable outcome. It is described with caution, as though it represents a loss of separation, a crossing of boundaries that should remain intact. There are also references to locations where these experiences are more common, places that align with earlier descriptions of unusual structures or altered landscapes. This suggests a possible connection, that proximity to certain environments may influence the likelihood of these occurrences, though the mechanism is not explained, only observed. In later interpretations, these accounts are often dismissed or reframed, described as psychological phenomena, cultural influence, shared belief systems. But the consistency of detail across unrelated sources presents a challenge to such explanations. Because the similarities extend beyond general themes, they include specific elements, specific sensations, specific environments, and specific patterns of progression. There is also the matter of timing. Some fragments suggest that these experiences occur more frequently during certain periods, not clearly defined, but associated with conditions that resemble those required for earlier rituals. Alignment, position, subtle environmental factors. This raises the possibility that these dreams are not random, but influenced, triggered, or perhaps allowed under certain conditions. If this is the case, then they may represent a form of interaction that does not require intentional action, a passive connection, one that occurs when the conditions are right, regardless of whether the individual understands what is happening. And this leads to a more unsettling possibility, that the presence described in earlier fragments, the immense beings, the structures, the altered environments, have not been entirely removed from the world. They exist beyond ordinary perception, accessible only under specific conditions or through altered states, and that these dreams are not creations of the human mind, but glimpses, partial observations of something that still exists, somewhere just beyond reach. If this interpretation is correct, then the fading of rituals does not represent the end of interaction, only a change in method, a shift from controlled engagement to uncontrolled exposure. And that shift carries its own risks. Because without understanding, without preparation, without boundaries, the experience becomes unpredictable, difficult to manage, difficult to interpret, and potentially difficult to escape. The ancient texts do not provide clear answers. They did not do not explain what these dreams truly are or what lies beyond them. They only record, briefly, carefully, as though the act of recording itself was already too much. And yet they persist, these fragments of experience, scattered across time, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be compared, waiting for someone to recognize that the pattern is not accidental, that the consistency is not coincidence, and that the boundary between dream and reality may not be as stable as it is commonly believed to be. Because if these experiences are not entirely internal, if they are influenced by something external, something that once existed in physical form, then they are not simply dreams. They are something else entirely. Something that reveals just enough to suggest that whatever once walked the earth may not be gone, only hidden, only distant, only waiting for the right conditions to be seen again. Even if only for a moment, in a place where the mind cannot fully protect itself from what it is not meant to understand. If the dreams are fragments of something still present, and the rituals were once methods of reaching beyond ordinary perception, then there remains one final category of evidence, one that is not symbolic, not interpretive, not dependent on altered states, but physical. Or at least it should be. Because within scattered references, both ancient and more recent, there are mentions of discoveries, findings that do not align with known human proportions, remains that suggest scale far beyond anything accepted in conventional history. These accounts are rare, often incomplete, and almost always dismissed. But they persist, across different regions, different time periods, and, most notably, different sources that do not appear to be directly connected. In early texts, there are brief mentions of bones, not in the context of burial or ritual, but as objects encountered, described with a level of detail that suggests observation rather than symbolism. There are references to lengths that exceed multiple human bodies, to structures that do not match any known anatomy. These descriptions are not emphasized. They appear briefly, often without explanation, as though they were not the focus, but simply part of the environment being recorded. In later interpretations, such references are often explained away, considered exaggerations, misunderstandings of animal remains. And in many cases, that explanation is accepted without question. But there are inconsistencies, because some of these descriptions do not align with any known species, not even in fragmented form. There are proportions that do not match, articulations that suggest different movement, density that implies weight beyond what would be expected. These details are rarely discussed in depth, but when they are compared across multiple fragments, they begin to form a pattern, one that is difficult to reconcile with coincidence. There are also accounts, more recent in origin, that follow a similar pattern. Reports of unusually large skeletal remains discovered during excavation, not formally documented, not preserved in major institutions, but recorded in local accounts, in personal journals, in reports that were never widely circulated. These accounts often share common characteristics. The remains are found unexpectedly, during construction, during excavation for unrelated purposes. They are recognized as unusual, measured, observed, and then they are removed. Not studied publicly, not displayed, but taken away. In many cases, the individuals who report these findings do not have the authority to preserve them. They document what they can, and then the remains are no longer accessible. There are also instances where photographs are mentioned, though these are rarely available, described as lost, confiscated, or never officially released. This absence of evidence is often cited as proof that the accounts are unreliable, and in some cases that may be true. But the consistency of the pattern raises questions, because the details repeat across different accounts, different regions, and different time periods. The scale is always similar, the structure always unusual, and the outcome always the same. The remains are no longer available for examination. There are also references to official responses, though rarely documented in detail. Mentions of authorities arriving at sites, of areas being restricted, of findings being reclassified. These responses are not always explained, but they suggest that the discoveries are recognized as significant, even if that significance is not publicly acknowledged. There is another detail that appears in several of these accounts: the condition of the remains. They are often described as old, extremely old, but not fully degraded, preserved in ways that are not entirely consistent with natural processes. This suggests that the conditions in which they were found, or perhaps the nature of the remains themselves, differ from typical expectations. There are also descriptions of surrounding environments, locations where the soil appears altered, where the composition of the ground differs from nearby areas. In some cases, these environments align with earlier descriptions of unusual structures or pathways. Though the connection is not explicitly stated, it is implied through proximity, as though the remains are not randomly distributed, but associated with specific locations that may have once been part of a larger system. There are also fragments that suggest awareness of these remains in earlier periods, not discoveries in the modern sense, but recognition, as though they were known, understood to exist, even if not fully explained. This aligns with the earlier references in ancient texts where bones are mentioned not as anomalies, but as part of the recorded environment, which raises an important question. If these remains were once known, why are they now considered unusual? Why are they treated as anomalies rather than expected findings? One possible explanation is that the context has been lost, that the knowledge required to interpret these remains correctly has faded over time. But another possibility exists, that the context was not simply lost, but removed, that the understanding of what these remains represent was deliberately altered so that their presence would no longer be recognized for what it is. There are also indications that some of these remains were not found in isolation, but in groups, arranged in ways that suggest positioning rather than random distribution. Though the details are often incomplete and the interpretations uncertain, this raises further questions about how these beings may have existed, whether they lived in proximity, whether they moved together, whether their remains reflect events rather than natural death. But once again, the available information is limited, fragmented, and often inaccessible. There is also the matter of scale in relation to the structures described in earlier fragments. If the cities and pathways were built or shaped for beings of immense size, then remains of similar scale would not be unexpected. They would be consistent, part of the same system, evidence that aligns with the descriptions rather than contradicting them. And yet, in modern understanding, such remains are considered impossible, which creates a conflict between what is recorded and what is accepted. This conflict is rarely addressed directly. Instead, it is resolved through dismissal, through reinterpretation, through the assumption that such findings cannot be real because they do not fit within the established framework. But the fragments remain, the accounts persist, and the patterns continue to appear, quietly, consistently, across time. There is also a final detail that adds to the unease surrounding these findings. In some accounts, there are references to reactions beyond simple curiosity. Individuals who encounter these remains describe a sense of discomfort, not merely from the size, but from something less tangible, a feeling that the remains are not entirely inert, that their presence carries weight, not physical, but perceptual, as though they affect the environment in subtle ways. This sensation is not explained, and it is often dismissed, but it appears frequently enough to be noted, especially when considered alongside earlier descriptions of presence, of structures that seem aware, of environments that resist occupation. It suggests that whatever these beings were, their influence may not be limited to their active existence, that traces of it remain, even after physical form has ceased. If that is the case, then the discovery of such remains is not simply a matter of historical curiosity. It is something else, something that challenges the boundary between past and present. Because if physical evidence of these beings exists, even in fragmented and inaccessible form, then the narrative shifts from speculation to possibility, from myth to something that may have once been real. And if it was real, then the question is no longer whether these beings existed, but why the evidence of their existence is so difficult to access. Why it is not studied openly, not preserved publicly. Why it appears only in fragments and then disappears. Because evidence, like memory, does not vanish without reason. It is lost, it is hidden, or it is removed. And when the same pattern repeats across time, across location, across source, it becomes increasingly difficult to attribute it to coincidence. Instead, it begins to suggest intention. A pattern of concealment, not absolute, but consistent, enough to ensure that whatever remains is never fully understood, never fully confirmed, and never fully integrated into the history that is widely accepted, but still present, still discoverable, still waiting for someone to look closely enough and ask the question that has been avoided for far too long. What exactly was found? And why is it no longer here? By this point in the fragments, a pattern has already begun to take shape. Presence becomes absence. Clarity becomes ambiguity. Discovery becomes disappearance. And surrounding all of it, there is something else, something less tangible, but no less consistent. Silence. Not the natural silence of forgotten history, not the quiet that comes from time passing, but a different kind of silence, one that appears intentional. Because when the subject of these immense beings, their structures, and their remains begins to surface too clearly, something changes. Accounts stop. Records become incomplete. Details vanish at the moment they are about to become undeniable. This pattern does not belong to a single era. It repeats across time. From the earliest preserved texts to more recent accounts of unusual discoveries. Whenever the narrative approaches something that would confirm physical reality, it is interrupted. Not always abruptly, but consistently. There are early references to individuals who attempted to study these anomalies in greater detail. Not storytellers, not priests, but observers. Those who approached the fragments not as tradition, but as information. They compared texts. They documented variations. They searched for physical evidence. And for a brief period, their work continued. Fragments were collected. Connections were noted. The pattern began to emerge more clearly. And then, the records stop. Not concluded, not resolved, simply unfinished. There are no explanations attached to these endings, no final statements, only absence. In later periods, similar patterns appear. Individuals who report unusual findings, who attempt to document them, who begin to ask questions that extend beyond accepted explanations. At first, their work is allowed, sometimes even encouraged. But as their conclusions become more specific, more aligned with the idea that something physical once existed, something changes. Access becomes limited, locations become restricted, materials become unavailable. In some cases, the individuals themselves withdraw, not publicly, not with formal statements, but quietly, as though continuing their work is no longer possible or no longer advisable. These occurrences are rarely documented in official records. They exist in fragments, references in correspondence, mentions in secondary accounts. But the pattern remains consistent. The closer the investigation comes to clarity, the more difficult it becomes to continue. There is also the matter of classification. Certain findings, when they are acknowledged at all, are often redefined, placed into categories that reduce their significance, described in ways that align with established frameworks, even when the original descriptions suggest something different. This process is subtle. It does not deny the existence of the finding, it reinterprets it, adjusts its meaning, until it no longer raises the same questions. And over time, that reinterpretation becomes accepted. The original context fades, and the finding becomes something else entirely. There are also instances where locations associated with unusual discoveries are altered, not destroyed, but changed. Access is restricted. Surroundings are modified. The environment is made unremarkable, so that even if the location is known, it no longer reveals what it once did. This is not always done in obvious ways. Sometimes it is gradual, a shift in use, a change in designation, until the original significance is no longer visible. There are also references to information that is preserved but not shared. Documents that exist, records that are maintained but not made accessible. These are not lost, they are contained, available only to a limited number of individuals for reasons that are not publicly explained. This controlled preservation creates a paradox. The information is not erased, but it is not allowed to influence the broader understanding of history. It exists, but only within boundaries, and those boundaries are rarely questioned. Because the existence of the information itself is not widely known, there is another aspect to this silence, one that is more difficult to define. In several accounts, individuals who pursue these topics describe a change in perception, not of the subject, but of their ability to engage with it. A growing difficulty in maintaining focus, in organizing information, in continuing the line of inquiry. This is not described as external interference, but as something internal, subtle, gradual, as though the process of investigation itself becomes unstable. These descriptions are often dismissed as psychological, the result of prolonged focus on complex or unconventional topics, but their consistency across unrelated accounts raises questions, especially when considered alongside the broader pattern of interruption and disappearance. There are also references to warnings, not formal, not documented in official language, but implied. Suggestions from colleagues, advisors, associates, that certain lines of inquiry may not be worth pursuing, not because they are incorrect, but because they lead to outcomes that are difficult to manage. These warnings are rarely explicit. They do not describe specific consequences, but they are often followed, which suggests that they are understood, even if not openly discussed. There is also the matter of public perception. Topics that fall outside accepted frameworks are often met with skepticism, dismissal, ridicule. This reaction serves as a form of containment, not through restriction, but through discouragement. It reduces the likelihood that such topics will be explored seriously, or that those who do explore them will be taken seriously. This dynamic reinforces the silence, not by removing information, but by ensuring that it does not gain traction, does not become part of mainstream discussion, does not influence collective understanding. And yet, despite all of this, the fragments remain, the patterns persist. The same details appear across different sources, the same sequences of discovery and disappearance, the same progression from clarity to silence. This repetition is difficult to ignore because it suggests that the silence is not random. It is consistent, structured, maintained. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to prevent a full reconstruction of the original narrative. Enough to ensure that what remains is always incomplete, always uncertain, always open to dismissal. But when the fragments are examined together, when the patterns are recognized, the silence itself becomes meaningful. It is no longer an absence of information. It is a form of information. It indicates where something once existed, where something approached clarity, and where that clarity was not allowed to continue. Because if the ancient texts, the structures, the remains, and the shared experiences all point toward the same possibility, that something immense once existed within the world, something that interacted with early humanity, something that left physical traces, then the silence surrounding that possibility is not simply caution. It is containment, a way of ensuring that the idea remains fragmented, unconfirmed, separated into pieces that cannot easily be assembled. But the pieces are still there, scattered across time, waiting to be connected, waiting for someone to recognize that the silence is not empty, it is deliberate, and that what lies within it may be more significant than what is openly recorded. Because silence, when it appears this consistently, is not the absence of a story. It is the part of the story that was never meant to be told. At least, not all at once. By now, the pattern is difficult to ignore. The texts shift. The details fade. The evidence appears and disappears, and silence follows wherever clarity begins to form. But there is one possibility that emerges from the fragments that is more unsettling than any other. Not that these beings existed, not that their traces remain hidden, but that they never truly left. Because in the earliest accounts, their disappearance is never clearly described. There is no final event, no definitive ending, no moment where the texts declare that these beings are gone. Instead, there is a gradual reduction in presence, a narrowing of interaction, a shift from visibility to absence. But absence, as the fragments repeatedly suggest, does not always mean non-existence. It can also mean inaccessibility. There are passages that describe withdrawal, not destruction, not extinction, but retreat, movement away from areas that were once accessible, toward locations that are no longer easily reached. These descriptions are subtle, often embedded within broader narratives, but they appear often enough to suggest that they are not incidental. They describe a change in relationship, not between humans and these beings, but between the world itself and those who inhabit it, as though the environment that once allowed for interaction no longer does. There are also references to boundaries, not physical barriers, but limits, conditions under which certain presences can no longer be encountered. In earlier fragments, these boundaries are not present. The beings move freely. They interact directly. They exist within the same space. But over time, that shared space begins to separate. The texts begin to describe regions that are no longer accessible, not because they are distant, but because they are different. Places that cannot be reached through ordinary movement. Locations that require specific conditions or cannot be reached at all. This shift is not explained, but it is consistent, and it aligns with the earlier descriptions of rituals and altered states. Methods that may have once allowed access to these regions, methods that later became incomplete or were no longer understood. There are also accounts that suggest these beings did not simply withdraw randomly. Their movement appears directed, purposeful, as though they were relocating, not disappearing. There are references to depths, not metaphorical depths, but physical, locations beneath the surface. Regions described as existing below the known world. These descriptions are often vague, but they carry a sense of structure, as though these are not empty spaces, but environments, places that can be occupied. There are also mentions of distances beyond the visible horizon, not in terms of travel, but in terms of perception, as though certain areas exist just beyond the limits of what can be seen, even when one is physically present. This suggests a form of separation that is not purely spatial, but perceptual. a shift in how the world is experienced, rather than a change in the world itself. There are also fragments that describe continued activity, not in the open, but at the edge of perception. Moments where something is sensed but not seen clearly. Movements that cannot be fully observed. Sounds that are heard but not located. These accounts are often brief, dismissed as uncertainty, but they appear consistently enough to form a pattern. They suggest that the absence of these beings may not be complete, only partial, only limited by the ability to perceive them. There are also references to environments that behave differently, regions where sound travels unusually, where space feels distorted, where the scale of objects appears inconsistent. These descriptions align closely with earlier accounts of structures and altered landscapes, but in these later fragments, they are not associated with visible presence, only with effect, as though something remains influencing the environment without revealing itself. There are also indications that certain individuals have been able to perceive more than others, not through ritual, not through deliberate action, but through circumstance. Moments where the boundary between ordinary perception and something else becomes less stable. These individuals describe brief glimpses, partial observations, not enough to confirm, but enough to suggest that something is still there. These experiences are not widely accepted. They are often dismissed or not shared at all. But they persist across time, across location, and always with similar characteristics. There is also the matter of scale. Even in these limited observations, the sense of size remains, the same imbalance, the same overwhelming presence. Though never fully visible, it is implied, felt, as though the mind cannot fully process what is being observed. There are also fragments that suggest intentional concealment, not by external forces, but by the beings themselves, as though they are aware of the separation, aware of the limits of perception, and capable of remaining beyond them. This is not described directly, but implied through behavior, through the way presence is hinted at but never fully revealed, as though observation is possible, but only to a certain extent, only under certain conditions. This raises a possibility that is difficult to dismiss, that these beings are not absent. They are simply no longer participating in the world in the same way. They exist within, but not within the same layer, not within the same conditions that allow for direct interaction. If this is the case, then the disappearance described in the texts is not an ending. It is a transition, a shift from one state of existence to another, one that places these beings beyond ordinary reach, but not beyond existence. There is also a final detail that appears in several late fragments, a suggestion that the separation is not permanent, that the boundary between these layers, these conditions, is not fixed, but variable, that under certain circumstances, the distance between them can decrease, not completely, but enough to allow for brief interaction, brief observation. This idea is not developed fully. It is mentioned and then left unexplored, as though it was not meant to be pursued. But its presence is significant, because it suggests that the current state of separation, the absence that defines the modern understanding of the world, is not absolute. It is conditional, dependent on factors that are not fully understood. And if that is true, then the question is not whether these beings still exist, but under what conditions they might become visible again, and whether those conditions can occur naturally or be influenced. Because if the boundary is not permanent, if the separation is not complete, then the world as it is currently understood is not as stable as it appears. It is only one state, one condition, maintained within certain limits, and beyond those limits, something else exists. Something that once moved freely across the land, that shaped the environment, that interacted with early humanity, and that now remains just beyond reach. Not gone, not destroyed, but waiting, in a state that is difficult to perceive, difficult to understand, and perhaps difficult to prevent, if the conditions that once allowed for its presence were to return. Because if they never truly left, then their absence is not a conclusion, it is a pause. And pauses, by their nature, do not last forever. If the separation between worlds is not permanent, if the boundary that now keeps these presences hidden is conditional, then there must exist something that defines that boundary, something that marks the division, something that determines where one state ends and another begins. In the scattered fragments that remain, there are references to such points, not described as doors in the conventional sense, not constructed as simple passages, but as locations, places where the conditions of reality itself appear to shift. These are not common locations, they are not easily found, and in many cases, they are not meant to be approached. In earlier accounts, these places are described with caution, not reverence, not admiration, but awareness, as though those who recorded them understood that proximity carried risk. There are descriptions of landscapes that appear normal at a distance, mountains, plains, regions that do not initially stand out. But as one approaches, subtle differences begin to emerge. The air feels heavier, sound behaves differently, distance becomes difficult to judge. These changes are not dramatic. They do not immediately reveal their significance, but they accumulate until the environment no longer feels stable, no longer feels consistent with ordinary experience. There are also references to visual distortion, not illusions, but inconsistencies, objects that appear closer or farther than they should be, edges that do not align, shadows that do not behave as expected. These descriptions are often brief, as though the observers struggled to articulate what they were experiencing, or, perhaps, as though the experience itself resisted clear description. There are also mentions of alignment, specific positions within these locations where the effects become more pronounced, points that must be reached, not by chance, but by intention. Though the method of identifying these points is not fully explained, only hinted at. This aligns with earlier references to rituals and timing, conditions that must be met in order for certain interactions to occur. There are also accounts of sound within these locations, not external noise, but resonance, low frequencies that seem to originate from the ground or from the space itself. These sounds are not constant. They appear intermittently, often associated with specific conditions, and when they occur, the environment changes further. Perception shifts. Orientation becomes unstable. There are also references to sensations of pressure, not physical weight, but something internal, as though the body is responding to an environment that does not match its expectations. These sensations are often accompanied by disorientation, difficulty maintaining focus, difficulty distinguishing between near and far. These effects are not described as harmful in the immediate sense, but they are consistently associated with discomfort, with the sense that one should not remain in that location for extended periods. There are also fragments that describe moments of transition, not complete, not stable, but brief. Instances where the environment appears to change, not gradually, but suddenly, as though one set of conditions is replaced by another for a moment. The landscape is different. Structures appear where there were none. Distances extend beyond what should be visible. Shapes emerge that do not belong. These moments are short, often ending before they can be fully observed. And when they end, the environment returns to its previous state, as though nothing has occurred. These accounts are rare, but they are consistent, and they align closely with the idea that these locations function as boundaries, points where the separation between states becomes thin, unstable. There are also references to individuals who attempted to remain within these locations, to observe longer, to understand more. The outcomes of these attempts are not described in detail, but they are not presented as successful. There are implications of disorientation that does not resolve, of perception that does not fully return to normal, as though prolonged exposure alters something, not just temporarily, but in a way that persists. There are also warnings within the fragments, not formal prohibitions, but clear suggestions that these locations should not be used, should not be explored beyond a certain point. The language of these warnings is notable. It does not appeal to belief or tradition. It refers to consequence, to outcomes that are not desirable, even if they are not fully explained. There is also the matter of distribution. These locations are not described as isolated. They appear in different regions, different environments, but with similar characteristics. This suggests that they are not random. They are part of a pattern, a system, though the structure of that system is not fully visible, only inferred. There are also hints that some of these locations align with the earlier descriptions of structures, that what once functioned as constructed environments may now function as boundary points, remnants of a system that no longer operates in the same way, but still influences the conditions of the world. There are also fragments that suggest that these locations were once more active, more accessible, that the transitions they allow were not always brief, not always unstable, but something that could be engaged with more directly. This aligns with earlier descriptions of rituals and interaction, methods that may have allowed for controlled movement between states, methods that have since been lost or altered. There is also a final detail that appears in several late fragments, a suggestion that these locations do not open on their own, that they require conditions, alignment, timing, perhaps even intention. This implies that the boundary is not passive. It is responsive. It can be influenced, though the mechanism is not explained, only suggested. If this is true, then these locations are not merely points of observation. They are potential points of access, places where the separation between worlds can be reduced, even if only briefly. And that possibility introduces a level of risk that cannot be ignored. Because if these gates, these boundary points, can be influenced, if they can be opened, even partially, then the separation that has defined the modern understanding of the world is not guaranteed. It is maintained under conditions that may not be permanent. And if those conditions change, then the boundary may change with them, allowing for interaction that has not occurred for a very long time. Interaction with something that once moved freely across the land, that shaped the environment, that withdrew but did not disappear, and that may still exist beyond the edge of perception, waiting, not for discovery, but for access. Because gates, by their nature, do not exist without purpose. They are not simply boundaries, they are points of transition. And a transition once initiated does not always stop where it is intended, especially when the forces on either side are not equal and not fully understood. Which is why, in the fragments that remain, the message is consistent. These places exist. They can be found. They can be approached. But they should not be opened. Because whatever lies beyond them is not something that was meant to return. At least, not yet. If the boundaries still exist, if the gates remain scattered across the world, and if the separation between states is not permanent, then there is one possibility that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. That something on the other side is not entirely silent. That whatever withdrew, Whatever now exists beyond ordinary perception may still be active, not in ways that are immediately visible, but in ways that can be detected if one knows where to look, or more precisely, if one knows how to listen. Because in both ancient fragments and more recent accounts, there are references to signals. Not messages in any conventional sense, not language, not communication intended for understanding, but patterns, repetitions, sequences that do not align with natural processes. These signals are not always recognized for what they are. They are often dismissed as anomalies, background noise, irregularities that do not require explanation. But when examined closely, they reveal consistency. There are descriptions of low-frequency vibrations, not strong enough to be felt as physical force, but detectable, persistent, appearing at intervals that do not match environmental cycles. In some cases, these vibrations are associated with specific locations, areas that align with earlier descriptions of boundary points, places where perception behaves differently, where the environment does not respond as expected. In these locations, the signals become more noticeable, more defined, though still not fully understood. There are also references to auditory phenomena, sounds that do not originate from identifiable sources, not echoes, not wind, not movement, but something else. Tones that appear briefly, then disappear, often described as too regular to be random and too irregular to be mechanical. These sounds are not always heard externally. In some cases, they are perceived internally. Similar to the sensations described in earlier accounts of dreams and rituals, a resonance that seems to bypass ordinary hearing, and yet remains unmistakable. There are also visual anomalies, though these are more difficult to document. Brief distortions, shifts in light, moments where the environment appears to change for an instant. These occurrences are often dismissed, attributed to error in perception, but they share a common characteristic. They are not entirely random. They appear in patterns, though the pattern is not immediately obvious. There are also reports of synchronized experiences, multiple individuals perceiving the same anomaly at the same time without prior coordination. These events are rare, but they are significant because they suggest that the source of the signal, whatever it may be, is not limited to individual perception. It exists externally, even if it cannot be fully observed. There are also references to attempts to measure these signals, to record them, to analyze their structure. In some cases, patterns have been identified. Repetitions that suggest sequence, variations that imply modulation. But the interpretation of these patterns remains uncertain, because they do not correspond to known systems of communication. They do not translate. They do not convey meaning in a way that can be easily understood. This raises an important question. If these signals are not intended to communicate with humans, then what is their purpose? There are several possibilities. One is that they are not signals at all, but byproducts, residual effects of processes that occur beyond perception. Another possibility is that they are attempts at communication, but not directed toward humanity. Signals meant for something else, something that shares the same state, the same level of existence. If this is the case, then what is being detected is not a message, but an exchange, one that humans are not meant to interpret, only able to observe in fragments. There is also the possibility that these signals are not intentional but structural, part of the system that maintains the boundary itself, fluctuations in the conditions that separate one state from another, manifesting as detectable anomalies. This would explain their association with specific locations, their dependence on certain conditions, and their irregular yet consistent nature. There are also fragments that suggest that these signals have changed over time, becoming more frequent, more noticeable, though the data is incomplete and the interpretation uncertain. This trend is difficult to confirm, but it appears often enough to be considered. There are also accounts of individuals who become particularly sensitive to these signals, not through training, but through repeated exposure. They begin to notice patterns that others do not, to detect variations that are otherwise ignored. This sensitivity is not always described as beneficial. In some cases, it leads to increased discomfort, difficulty maintaining focus, a sense of being affected by something that cannot be controlled. These descriptions align with earlier accounts of prolonged exposure to boundary locations and suggest that the signals themselves may carry influence, not just information. There are also warnings, though, as with earlier fragments, they are not formal. They are implied. Suggestions that these signals should not be pursued, not analyzed too deeply, not followed beyond a certain point, because doing so may lead to outcomes that are not fully understood. There is also the matter of correlation. Some fragments suggest that these signals appear in conjunction with other phenomena, changes in environment, shifts in perception, moments of instability in boundary regions. This suggests that they are not isolated events, but part of a larger process, a system that operates beyond ordinary awareness and occasionally becomes detectable. If this is true, then the signals represent more than anomalies. They are indicators, evidence that something is occurring, something active, something ongoing, beyond the limits of perception. And that activity, whatever its nature, is not entirely disconnected from the world as it is experienced. It influences, it affects, even if only subtly, even if only under certain conditions. There is also a final possibility, one that is not directly stated, but implied through the convergence of all these fragments, that the signals are increasing, not randomly, but as a result of changing conditions, that the boundary is becoming less stable, less consistent, allowing for greater interaction, greater leakage, greater overlap. If this is the case, then what is being detected is not simply background activity, but change, a shift in the system that has maintained separation for so long. And if that system is changing, then the implications extend beyond isolated phenomena. They suggest that the state of the world itself may not be as fixed as it appears, that the separation between what is seen and what is hidden is not guaranteed, and that the signals, these faint, persistent patterns, may be the first indication that something is beginning to move again. Not openly, not visibly, but in ways that can be detected if one is paying attention. Because signals, by their nature, are not random. They originate from process, from activity, from something that exists and continues to exist, even when it cannot be fully observed. Which means, whatever once shaped the world, whatever withdrew beyond perception, may not be as distant as it seems. It may still be there, still active, still part of a system that has not fully stopped, only changed, only hidden, and now, possibly, beginning to be noticed again. Even if no one fully understands what is being noticed, or what it may lead to. If the signals continue, and if the boundary continues to shift, because the difference between silence and signal is not just sound, it is intention. And intention, even when not directed at us, still implies something, is happening just beyond the edge of what we are able to perceive. By now, the fragments have formed a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Not a complete story, not a fully preserved history, but something else. A structure made of incomplete pieces, each one uncertain on its own, but together, suggesting something far more coherent and far more unsettling. Because when the ancient texts are examined alongside the altered passages, the structures that should not exist, the remains that were never fully revealed, the rituals that were softened into symbolism, the dreams that feel external, the gates that mark unstable boundaries, and the signals that continue without explanation. They do not point in separate directions. They converge toward a single possibility: that what has been interpreted as myth, as metaphor, as symbolic narrative, may have originated from something far more literal, something that once existed within the world, not as an idea, but as presence. And that presence was not small, not subtle, not easily ignored. It shaped the environment. It influenced early humanity. It existed on a scale that does not align with the modern understanding of life. And yet, it is no longer part of what is commonly accepted as reality. Which raises the central question: why? Why would something so large, so influential, so consistently described across multiple sources be reduced to fragments, reinterpreted, and ultimately separated from the framework of accepted history? There are several possible explanations. The simplest is error, that the early observers misunderstood what they encountered, that the descriptions were exaggerated, distorted through retelling, and eventually mythologized. This explanation is widely accepted because it is comfortable. It allows the fragments to exist without requiring them to be true. But it does not fully account for the consistency, the repeated patterns, the alignment of details across unrelated sources, the physical implications that appear again and again. There is another explanation, less comfortable but more consistent with the available fragments: that the early observers did not misunderstand, that they recorded what they experienced as accurately as they could within the limits of their language and perception, and that what they recorded was real. If this is the case, then the transformation of these records into mythology is not a natural evolution. It is a process, one that changes meaning, reduces clarity, alters interpretation, until the original context is no longer visible. This process does not require a single decision. It does not require a central authority. It can occur gradually, through repetition, through reinterpretation, through the natural tendency to make the unfamiliar more understandable. But there are aspects of this transformation that suggest something more deliberate: the consistent removal of specific details, the reduction of scale, the disappearance of physical context. These changes are not random. They follow a pattern that moves the narrative away from physical reality and toward abstraction, toward symbolism, toward a form that can be accepted without raising fundamental questions. Because if the original descriptions are taken literally, they lead to conclusions that challenge the foundation of modern understanding: that humanity was not the first dominant presence on Earth, that the environment was once shaped by beings of immense scale, that the boundary between what is visible and what is hidden is not fixed. These conclusions are not easily integrated into existing frameworks. They require a reevaluation, not just of history, but of reality itself. And that reevaluation is not simple. It introduces uncertainty. It challenges assumptions. It raises questions that do not have immediate answers, which creates a natural resistance, a tendency to reject, to reinterpret, to simplify. But there is also the possibility that the resistance is not entirely natural, that it is reinforced, maintained, through the same patterns of silence and reinterpretation observed in the fragments. Because if the knowledge of these beings, their structures, their remains, their continued presence beyond perception, were widely accepted, it would change the way the world is understood, not gradually, but fundamentally. It would shift the perception of what is possible, what has existed, what may still exist. And such a shift would not be easy to control. There is also the matter of evidence, or rather, the controlled absence of it. The repeated pattern of discovery and removal, the restriction of access, the reclassification of findings. These actions suggest that the possibility of physical evidence is not entirely dismissed. It is managed, contained, allowed to exist, but not to accumulate, not to reach a point where it becomes undeniable. Because undeniable evidence changes everything. It removes interpretation, it eliminates doubt, and it forces acceptance, which may be precisely what has been avoided. There is also the role of perception, the way information is received, interpreted, accepted, or rejected. This is influenced not only by evidence, but by expectation, by what is considered possible, by what is considered real. And when a concept falls outside those expectations, it is often dismissed, not because it is false, but because it is incompatible. This creates a self-reinforcing system where certain ideas are excluded, not through direct suppression, but through lack of acceptance, through the absence of a framework in which they can exist. But the fragments do not disappear. They remain, persistent, consistent, waiting to be examined without the assumptions that limit their interpretation. And when they are, they reveal something that is difficult to ignore. That the narrative of the past, as it is currently understood, may be incomplete. Not slightly, but significantly. That there are elements that have been reduced, reinterpreted, or set aside because they do not fit. But their presence within the fragments suggests that they were once part of a larger understanding, one that has not been fully preserved, one that may not have been meant to be. Because understanding leads to awareness, and awareness leads to action. And action, in the context of something that still exists beyond perception, carries risk. Because if the boundary between states is not permanent, if the gates can be approached, if the signals indicate activity, then the separation that defines the current state of the world is not guaranteed. It is maintained. And what is maintained can change. Which brings the fragments to their most unsettling implication. Not that the past was different, but that the present is not as stable as it appears. That the world, as it is experienced, is only one version, one state, held in place by conditions that are not fully understood, and that beyond those conditions, something else exists. Something that once shaped the world, that withdrew but did not disappear, that remains active in ways that are only partially detectable, and that may not remain separate forever. Because if the signals are increasing, if the boundaries are shifting, if the conditions are changing, then the distance between what is known and what is hidden is decreasing. Not enough to be obvious, not enough to be undeniable, but enough to be noticed, enough to be recorded, enough to form a pattern. And patterns, when they persist, lead to conclusions, even if those conclusions are not immediately accepted. Because truth, when it is present, does not require belief. It only requires observation. And the fragments, taken together, suggest that something has been observed, something that was not meant to be fully understood, not because it is impossible, but because understanding it would change everything, including the assumption that humanity is alone in shaping the world, or ever was. And that assumption, more than any other, may be the one that was never meant to be questioned. At least, not until the boundary begins to shift and what was hidden is no longer able to remain that way. There is a final question that remains. It is not written directly in the fragments, not stated clearly in any text, but it exists between the lines. If they never truly left, if the boundary is not permanent, if the signals are increasing, if the gates still exist, then what happens? If the separation ends, not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough for presence to return. The ancient texts do not describe such a moment, at least not in a way that is preserved. but they do describe conditions, changes in the environment, shifts in balance, moments where stability is no longer maintained. These descriptions appear before transitions, before the reduction of presence, before the withdrawal, which suggests a pattern, that the state of the world is not fixed. It changes, and when it changes, so does what can exist within it. If that pattern holds, then the current state of separation is not permanent. It is temporary, maintained by conditions that can shift. And if those conditions shift again, then the separation may weaken, allowing for something that has not occurred for a very long time, a return. Not necessarily intentional, not necessarily controlled, but possible. There are fragments that hint at such possibilities, not as predictions, but as implications, statements that suggest the world is cyclical, that conditions repeat, that what has happened before can happen again. These ideas are often interpreted symbolically, as cycles of creation and destruction, but within the context of all that has been observed, they may represent something more literal, the return of conditions, not just events, conditions that allow for different forms of existence, different interactions, different presences. There are also references to instability, moments where the environment behaves unpredictably, where patterns do not hold, where boundaries become less defined. These moments are often brief, but they are significant because they represent a break in consistency, a deviation from what is expected. And if such deviations increase, if they become more frequent, more pronounced, then the stability of the current state becomes uncertain. There are also indications that human activity may influence these conditions, not intentionally, but indirectly. Changes to the environment, alterations in natural systems, shifts in balance. These factors are not described in detail, but they are mentioned, as though the state of the world is responsive, not static. And if it is responsive, then it can be affected, not just by natural cycles, but by actions, whether those actions are understood or not. There is also the matter of awareness. If the fragments are recognized, if the patterns are understood, then the possibility of interaction increases. Not because awareness creates change, but because it removes limitation. It allows for exploration, for attempts to access, to engage. And such attempts, even if incomplete, even if unsuccessful, may influence the boundary, may weaken it, even slightly. There are also references to consequences, though they are not described in detail, only implied. Statements that suggest that interaction is not without effect, that the return of presence would not be neutral. Because the imbalance described in the earliest fragments still exists, the difference in scale, in influence, in capability has not changed. Only the separation has. If that separation is reduced, then the imbalance returns, not as memory, but as reality. There are also fragments that suggest that not all of these beings are the same, that some may be more active, more aware, more capable of interaction. This introduces uncertainty because it implies variation, different responses, different intentions. Not a single outcome, but multiple possibilities, some of which may not align with human survival. There is also the question of recognition. If presence returns, would it be understood, or would it be dismissed, misinterpreted, as it has been in the past? This is not a trivial detail, because recognition determines response, and response determines outcome. If the return is not recognized for what it is, then the opportunity to respond appropriately is lost, and history may repeat itself, not as myth, but as event. There is also a final implication, one that is not stated directly, but emerges from the convergence of all fragments. That the separation, the boundary that currently exists, may not have been created solely to protect humans. It may also serve another purpose, to contain, to limit, to prevent something from fully re-entering the world. If this is the case, then the weakening of that boundary does not only allow for observation, it allows for movement, for transition from one state to another. And such movement, once initiated, may not be easily reversed. Because boundaries, once broken, do not always restore themselves, especially when the forces on either side are not equal. There are no clear predictions in the fragments, no specific timeline, no defined sequence of events, only patterns, conditions, possibilities, and warnings. Always indirect, always incomplete, but consistent. Do not approach. Do not attempt to access. Do not assume understanding, because the system that maintains separation is not fully understood, and interfering with it carries risk, not theoretical, but real. The final image that emerges from these fragments is not one of sudden destruction, not a dramatic end, but something quieter, more gradual, a shift, a change in conditions, where the world begins to behave differently, where the boundary becomes less stable, where presence becomes possible again. At first, only in fragments, brief observations, partial interactions, but over time, more consistent, more defined, until what was once hidden is no longer entirely beyond reach. And at that point, the question is no longer whether they exist or whether they once walked the earth. The question becomes, what happens next? Because if they return, even partially, even briefly, it will not be as it was before. The world has changed. Humanity has changed. But the imbalance remains. And imbalance, when reintroduced into a system, does not remain stable. It leads to adjustment, to correction, to outcomes that are not always predictable. The fragments do not tell us what those outcomes will be. They do not describe the future. They only reveal the past and the conditions that shaped it. But within those conditions, there is a pattern. And within that pattern, there is a possibility that what once was may not remain in the past, that the silence, the absence, the separation are not permanent states, but phases, and phases, by their nature, end when the conditions that sustain them begin to change. So the final question remains, not as a conclusion, but as something unresolved, something that cannot be answered with certainty, only considered. If the boundary weakens, if the signals continue, if the gates open, even for a moment, will we recognize what is happening, or will we repeat the same process? Observe, record, misunderstand, and only realize the truth when it is no longer possible to ignore. Because by then, the separation may already be gone, and whatever has been waiting beyond perception will no longer need to remain hidden. It will simply be here again. Thank you for watching Forbidden Lore. If you've made it to the end of this story, then you've walked with me through fragments of something ancient, something hidden just beneath the surface of what we think we understand about our world. Stories like this are not just meant to be heard, they are meant to linger. So tonight, when the world grows quiet, when the noise fades and your thoughts begin to wander, ask yourself one simple question. What if the past was never truly gone? And if it isn't, what might still be waiting? If you found this journey intriguing, unsettling, or even just a little bit thought-provoking, make sure to subscribe to Forbidden Lore so you don't miss the next story hidden in the shadows of history. Leave a like if you want more deep dives into ancient mysteries, and share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the most interesting ideas come from those who are willing to question what they've been told. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, And remember, some stories are forgotten for a reason.